Broadcasting from Boston, Massachusetts, the Smart Cities podcast is the only podcast dedicated to all things smart cities. The podcast is the creation of ARC Advisory Group's Smart City practice. ARC advises leading companies, municipalities, and governments on technology trends and market dynamics that affect their business and quality of life in their cities. To engage further, please like and share our podcast or reach out directly on Twitter at Smart City Viewpoints or on our website at www.arcweb.com/industries/smart-cities.
Welcome again to another episode of the Smart City Podcast. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Herb C., Senior Partner at Pioneer Partners. Welcome, Herb. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jim. Thanks so much for having me on.
Hey, it's great to have you. Herb, can we get started with you giving us a little bit of background of how you came to this smart city ecosystem?
Sure, Jim. I'm happy to do that. Well, really, there are a couple of things that I think are valuable for the listener to understand of what makes me tick and how I think about things in the smart city space. One of the first things that's somewhat salient would be I was in the military for 11 years, and as a military helicopter pilot, you're given missions to accomplish, but you also understand that you don't have a parachute, so you take off expecting to crash, and you always are coming up with plan B to be able to make sure in the event that you've got a problem that you know how to accomplish a mission and not have bad consequences. So that's the first thing. Smart cities, there's a lot of issues that you come up with. You don't always know how to get there, but you always have a plan B, C, or D in your pocket. Another piece that kind of led me to where I'm at, Jim, is I spent a number of years, 14 years in the investment and finance space. And so whether it was managing money or getting into investment banking, I was even on a venture fund. Really, it gave me an understanding of the economics and the orientation, especially for stakeholders. The return on investment, both from cities and from the business market, they're really important, and that really gave me a foundation. And then lastly, how I got here, we took the combination of those experiences and my background along with my partners. And in 2009, we started a company called Think Big Partners. And that really started off as a technology incubator. We started running accelerator programs for emerging technology. And that program caught the eye of some of the larger Fortune 50 technology companies. We started doing innovation partnering, of which that led to our first project that we were asked to do. Really is more of an example of how to use advanced technology to help cities. Back in 2014, when Cisco approached us, we really didn't know what a smart city was, but we knew that technology could be used as a tool to solve problems. That's how we got into the space in 2014. And since that time, we've worked in probably 40 cities since. And Pioneer Partners was spun out from Think Big Partners a number of years ago to specialize and focus exclusively on digital transformation and helping cities, make that journey.
Wow. So you've got a varied career there. Now that you're involved in the world of smart cities and more particularly smart city public-private partnerships, let's get started with you giving us your perspective of the history of smart city PPPs.
Sure. Well, what's interesting to note is sometimes you don't realize that you're in a partnership until you're kind of along the way. And so if you think about the role that cities play, and they represent the citizens and the businesses, and they're trying to create a high quality of life. If you really start going back, when they first started contemplating this back in 1974, LA created what they'll call a urban big data project, and it was called a cluster analysis of Los Angeles. And really back then, it was an intelligent viewpoint using data to try and better understand how they can improve the quality of life. Well, if you follow then the course of that line of thinking, Amsterdam created something, 20 years later, and then you started getting the commercial markets. IBM actually, along with Cisco, in the early 2000s, they started really investing a lot of time and money into the research, and that partnership started to happen because when the private sector market got involved with these cities, that's where the partnership really began, because you can't really do research in a vacuum. And then over the years, as you saw this, as it started really first blossoming, you had Barcelona that came out. There was a city called Yokohama, that was a demonstration project in 2010. There was a project in South Korea that took place, and the evolution of the partnerships went from theoretical and academic to more research and practical. And then it started getting into specific challenges that people were facing, whether it was urbanization or traffic or climate change. Although they didn't call it that back then, but really that's where the evolution of partnerships came. And really there's been probably 20 projects I could point to over the course of the last 30 years, but especially since mid-late 2000s, that's really where they started to pop up.
Wow, that is fascinating. So you alluded to an evolution of P3s over those decades. How have they changed in the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, what's been interesting, Jim, is if you go back, let's go back about 10 years ago. You had a combination of technologies and goals, and I'll even say hopes of the cities that started really coming together and butting up against each other. And so about 10 years ago, you had the hope and promise of what we'll call smart cities, impact areas, but the technology didn't quite make it. And there's a whole array of technologies that has to come together. And so you have to have connectivity. That connectivity provides that base layer. Then you have to actually the application itself. So what was the starting point of a good discussion where people thought they were quite ready for prime time became not quite ready for prime time. And so the partnerships went from how do we get something done and realizing that we aren't quite there to, okay, we're starting to get some success. You're getting incremental progress. And they started developing a much more robust set based on learning, understanding, working how to collaborate. And it became more of a working relationship that was an ongoing process versus kind of a project with a very finite beginning and end. Because again, to get from point A to point B is not always well defined. And I think now you've got an evolution of mutual benefit stakeholders working in an ongoing conversation that really understand that they have to be able to represent both sides to be successful. And you have to look at all the array of technologies together all at the same time to be able to really understand if that partnership's going to work. So I think it's become much more of an ongoing, relationship that has a lot of stakeholders versus, one or two parties. They kind of dream something up in the back room and then just give it a shot.
Well, Herb, you allude to numbers of stakeholders. Public-private partnership intuitively has two partners, public and the private. Who are these other stakeholders?
Well, it's interesting. So if you think about public, let's first kind of look at that. Historically, if you really look at especially the role of innovation, the federal government has been acting as what I will call a catalyst or even a convener, for decades. But as you go on, and especially when you go under the word smart cities, the cities really are probably still the last biggest group of people that can work together but can still have enough impact, but it can be manageable to get success. So when you look at the cities sometimes are just a city by itself, but if there's a region around them, and so depending on where you live, I'll pick an easy one, Manhattan, and New York City, but then you look around, the dynamic that New Jersey may have. And if you're living in New Jersey, but working in downtown Manhattan, these regions. So the first public stakeholders are often regions with the city as an epicenter. But because of the nature of things, state, whether it's funding or it's the ability to be able to, pull in other favorable regulation, because some of the regulations are at a state level. And then certainly the federal government, particularly in the age of IJA funds and ARPA that we just came out of, you've got multiple stakeholders just on the public side. If you start now unpacking the next interim step here, it's kind of a hybrid. It's the NGOs, it's the academic organizations, which aren't always well understood on the public side. You've got folks that, if you're, let's say, working off a grant from NIST, or you've got something coming out of COVID, the National Institute of Health played a really big role in the National Science Foundation. Even though you've got federal agency, but you've got now specific agencies that are working on a microcosm that is very specific. So you've got not just cities, states, or federal government, but you now have agencies. And then you bolt on the private sector, and that really has expanded too. besides the large companies, which again, historically, like the Ciscos and the IBMs, and, they've been very leaders in their space for a long time. You've got now on the private side, these emerging technology companies. And having come out of the incubator space and worked, on the investment side too, some of the best ideas are coming from these early stage companies. And really the partnership that those can have with the larger companies, and collectively they then form with these cities, is really interesting. And then the last stakeholder, which is one that is really not necessarily has gotten overlooked, but people haven't really thought about in these terms. There's some projects out there that really brought this to light. It's the public. And so if you think about public, private, and then the next party being people, the people really have got to be on board, whether you're trying to design a system with kind of human-centered design and understand the needs, or you're trying to get them involved, or frankly, you're trying to get them involved in the conversation to make sure that they're not apprehensive or scared or they don't lend support. There's all these issues that if you don't get the public involved, you can really have some very tough consequences. So I think it's multiple public, multiple private, and now even more than ever, the people have got to be involved. So how many P's is that, Jim? I know it's more than a
That's
few.
a lot of P's. Thanks, Herb. It's interesting that over the last probably decade or two, there has been, an evolution in that thought, just as you described. And, some folks out there have actually given it some labels. And Smart City 1.0 was when vendors, suppliers would come to a city and promote their solution as a Swiss Army knife that did everything. But those early installations, as you undoubtedly know, did not work out as well as everyone had intended. So the Smart City 2.0 perspective was that it really was a two entity partnership. A true and very simple public-private partnership between the city, the public agency, and then the vendor for perhaps, a remote control street lighting system. But those two, while they were better than earlier attempts at smart city efforts, they fell short of the goals as well. So the Smart City 3.0 terminology has been written about quite a bit in the last, I would say, 5 years. And it is exactly that. It includes all of those other smaller stakeholders that are out there. So it might be the downtown business district. It might be the parent-teacher association that's lobbying for a safe route to school for the kids to walk to school. It might be the bicycling community. It might be some environmentalists. It could be taxpayers. There's a lot of those that really need to be defined before you start, because in my anecdote, and I'm a bike rider, you don't want to build a bridge without a bike lane and then have the bicycle community come to you later and say, where's my bike lane? So you really do need to have a very conscious effort of defining those stakeholder communities up front, or else you risk disappointing someone.
Absolutely. Now that's interesting. When people think about scaling, Jim, the Smart City 3.0 model has to scale, and scaling doesn't always mean up. It means adoption, and it means be able to create, sustainable funding models. And you've got to be able to make sure that the people are getting the impact that they need. So the scaling is actually more penetration and sustainability. You're exactly right. If you build a bike lane and it's not wide enough, or people aren't using it, or other challenges with it, how good of a bike lane is that, right?
No, exactly. So Herb, let's go back to we've talked all about the evolution of public-private partnerships over the last 10 or 20 years, but can you summarize why was that change necessary?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, and I'll just kind of go through some thoughts here. The first thing is that you've got to be able to create, if we start with the people comment that I made, you've got to really be able to help the companies, and frankly the cities too, understand how do people live with the technology that they're using. And that's a dimension that's got a lot of different facets. You've got a group of folks that are digital natives, and they view technology and privacy and things like that very different than, folks like maybe, myself or you, based on where they're coming from. And so that partnership has got to be through multiple lenses because, frankly, younger generations are going to live with the technology a lot longer than you and me. And you've got to be able to understand that insight. If you look at trying to understand the public also involved in understanding the technology, how's that also going to potentially impact them or compromise their way of life if that's a concern? There have been some projects, and I'm not trying to pick on any projects, but all of us are learning all the time. But there was a project up in Toronto that was started in 2017, of which was well intended. It was 800 acres, and it was really started by it was with Sidewalk Labs and Google, and there was a lot of good ideas there. We actually did a project in Toronto just prior to that was not directly in support, but it was to help the Infrastructure Canada, challenge process, to get Toronto up to speed. But the public didn't understand what was going on, and when their requests for information were really not met to their satisfaction, they became very nervous and concerned. And so we've seen this evolution of these partnerships has got to take, into account all the different stakeholders. And ultimately, if you really think about technology as really the means and not the end, the most important stakeholder in all of this is the people. And so the process had to change to include the people, representing not only their needs. Every person has got multiple different identities. Myself, I'm a father. I'm an individual. I'm a business owner. I'm a community member. I'm a volunteer. We all have different needs at different times. And you've got to be able to understand the different ways that people use the technology to be able to affect what they're trying to do at the time that they're using it or even experience it. So that's the first part. We had to change the process to make sure that people weren't fearful. They understood it. They're going to support it, whether it's tax dollars or just allowing you to scale and get the support and really continue to actually, frankly, act as the co-creator and take part in the ongoing innovation process. Because once the technology is deployed, it's iterative. You have to keep building additional insights and new use cases so people can adapt to it and technology companies and cities can respond to it. So that's one dimension, Jim. You want me to go through a few more?
Sure. Go ahead.
So the other thing that we saw in these public-private partnerships, call it circa mid 2010 to 15 era, you started getting from an academic, interesting, one or two stakeholder partnership models into now trying to deploy things. But these deployments were really initially what we'll call well-intended but demonstration projects with somewhat of ill-defined what does success look like. And so let's say if it was streetlights as an example. Streetlights are great technology. They're trusted. They're commonly used. It's the standard today. They're well understood, and the impact is very real and it's measured. But the first handful of streetlight projects that were out there, they were really, I think, deployments to kind of showcase the technology, but there wasn't really a plan to scale and adopt the technology on the city side. And maybe it was because of lack of infrastructure, or they didn't know if they had the funding available, or they didn't really understand the labor that it would take to be able to implement them. But on the other side of the partnership, you have these very large companies that are building the technology. They may or may not have paid attention to the end user customer. In this case, it's both the city and the citizens. And lastly, these pilots didn't really lead to procurement. And if you're going to have a good partnership, these privately held companies or publicly traded, but private companies, they've got to have a path to procurement. And so if they don't understand what success is going to be for the city or the citizens, how in the world can they go to procurement? Because ultimately these companies have a mandate to make money, but the parties really need to get together and say, okay, do we understand the rules of engagement? And the public-private partnerships initially were kind of pilots to nowhere. They kind of felt good, a lot of activity, not a lot of progress, and ultimately didn't really have the impact for either company, and ultimately the citizens didn't really get the benefit because it didn't go anywhere.
No, that's fascinating, Herb. As you spoke about, Toronto and some of the challenges that have occurred, the words customer centricity come to mind for me. That ultimately it's that other looser group of stakeholders that really are the customer, the pedestrian, the person having dinner outside, on the sidewalk, the bicycle rider, the taxpayer. And what's often unsaid is that concern about privacy and about transparency. In particularly about data collection and tracking people. That has been understated in some of these smart city efforts to date.
It really has. There are a couple, I guess, ways that I look at this. For those digital natives, as an example that I just talked about, their viewpoint of privacy and transparency is really different. Now, what's interesting, I am a very private person. I respect privacy, and sometimes, you look at the role technology has, you feel like you're compromising it. The reality is, I think that there's a constant bargain, because I willingly and very happily carry my phone, and that phone isn't just a phone. Like all of us, we carry smartphones these days, or most of us, and that phone knows everything about us. Now, just because it knows it doesn't mean that people can use that data. And so I really think there's kind of a dynamic here to where the folks that are, first of all, giving up information, I think there's a level of transparency that people have to have and be willing and aware. And, you can't have it both ways, unfortunately. The digital natives, they assume that they have no privacy. They think it's gone. They don't necessarily like it, but they just have no expectation of it. Versus somebody like myself, I hope for it, and I do read the terms and conditions of the apps that you download. I think most people don't. But as you give this up, the privacy's got to be transparent. It has to be accurate. If the policy changes, it needs to be updated. And I think it has to be very real. But I think people need to understand, the privacy is a lot of different dimensions. There's been regulation in Europe, GDPR. And then, in California, they adopted a version of that here, a couple of years ago. But privacy is important. But the reality is that, what does privacy mean? I certainly don't want.
Those are, that's one half of the trade-off, because once you have, IoT and all this communications technology, you do get, a raft of benefits. Shortly, there's going to be an autonomous vehicle that will pick you up at your house, or your pizza will get delivered by an autonomous vehicle.
Right.
It helps with sustainability and de-siloing of all types of city and public agency applications. So let me ask you, Herb, on a slightly different subject, how do you see these public-private partnerships evolving in the future?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting because, first of all, if you look at the cities, I think these partnerships, you start creating a network. The first one is that I think companies can be both competitive and cooperative, so that co-opetition model to be able to advance technologies, to be able to help the cities, and the cities working with each other too, and the peer-to-peer learnings. I think you're going to get a very, what I call, networked effect of these public-private partnerships, because we all need to learn faster together. There's a lot of technologies, some of the bigger ones that are on my mind these days, artificial intelligence for sure, autonomous vehicles, there's a long way to go still there. You've got, robotics. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And if we can all learn from each other and work better together, even if you're in competition on the private side, I think you've got to be able to change of how we talk about and communicate, whether it's setting standards, adhering to the standards, collectively as groups, or figuring out what's working and what's not working. I sure don't want to be in a, in a technology or a vehicle that, if another city had an experience that the company that is producing the vehicle that I'm in could have learned from, I'd sure like to avoid, getting into a fender bender or worse just because they didn't give out that information. So I think that the network effect is one of them. I think another is you've got to find different ways to increase the funding. And so again, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, created, $550 billion in new spending, but that's great. ARPA, created spending prior to that. But what was interesting about ARPA, that was the first time that you really had at a mass scale a higher level of accountability. Where do the funds go? How did you use them? What's the impact? I think the change that needs to happen is that we have to look at the return on investment dimension. It's not just financial. I think there are really three actually four, but the fourth one is a little bit opaque. But they're really dimensions that we have to evaluate these public-private partnerships in a return on investment dimension. And I think we have to rethink of how we look at this and measure success. So I think those are two biggest areas that I think we have to look at it. And then lastly, we've got such big problems or challenges in the world today. I think we have to look at it through a wider group of stakeholders, some of the innovation that's coming out of different segments, the business community and the academic community. I think there's a way to continue to advance ways to bring them in so these public-private partnerships can address the problems faster and more effectively by bringing in more stakeholders to the equation. So that network effect isn't just between the bigger stakeholders, but it's also looking at more corners to be able to turn over to find the best ideas.
Sure, Herb. Let me ask you a little bit of an off-topic question. Cost accounting in the private business world is fairly well defined. In the public agency world, not so much. Your truck roll may be it could be costed out at $1,000 or zero because the person is on staff and the truck's been paid for. How do you go about trying to build financial business cases around some of these other softer smart city applications?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, let me give you one example that I think most people can relate to, but it's got, again, a lot of different dimensions, but I'm going to get into some specific economics as an example. And so at least where I live, nobody says, gosh, I really enjoy being stuck in traffic. I don't think anyone really ever says that, right? Even if you have a good podcast you want to listen to in your car, you'd like to get home for dinner. And so if you think about, as a starting point, just something as simple as being stuck in traffic, okay? Nobody wants to be stuck in traffic. So for every extra mile that I drive, the vehicle that I'm in, I drive a truck. It puts 404 grams of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. So the average vehicle puts about 6.5 tons a year into the atmosphere. So you've got a very simple dynamic of somebody spending time stuck in traffic. I'm driving. So now I've got CO2 going to the atmosphere. By the way, for every hour that I spend in my car, I'm not really incredibly productive, whether I want to have, family time or, maybe I could, work another hour for my employer or, make money, but there's a cost of time. But if I start looking at the entire daisy chain of that extra mile driven or hour in my car, let me give you the economics of that. So for every ton of CO2, it's about $50 a ton that, it costs to be able to, deal with that. The health concerns that go with that, those particulates that go into the air pollution go into water systems. And that water system then, whether it's an aquifer or surface water from, let's say, a river, goes into the human body. The cost of healthcare because of contaminated water, depending on the community that you're in, but you can quantify that very easily. If you think about every car that is on a road, especially in an urban environment as an example, I'm stuck in a downtown traffic jam. That cost of a vehicle on the road, about 40% of all the vehicles at any given time in an urban environment are looking for a parking space. And so we're not only burning gas, which is, a natural resource and precious, but I am also now potentially creating a hazard to public safety because I can run over a pedestrian. There's a cost to the economics of an accident. Imagine if I could reduce the cost of that, truck roll being an ambulance and a fire truck instead of a utility truck stringing a street light. The ability to be able to look at, okay, I now have an extra 100 hours a year that I can do something that I'm not stuck in traffic. The average median, cost for most communities is about $50 to $55 per hour. Great. I just could use it a little more productively. Maybe I can earn an extra income, or by the way, that extra income goes into a tax base. That tax base can fund a community. And so you start getting the economics of environmental impact, workforce development, economic development, public health, personal health, public safety. All of that is just for me sitting in a traffic jam for an extra hour, driving an extra mile because I'm exiting off there trying to get around traffic. So the economics are actually very straightforward in multiple dimensions. There's the financial, there's the social. By the way, the social programs in most governments, there's a budget attached to that, so it becomes financial again. There's the environmental and sustainable, and then there's that human element back to the quality of life. And so all of these can be translated into highly quantifiable numbers. We can go GDP on the high end to, longevity and, quality of life on the low end. And in between, there are all these different economic development factors that cities like, and the companies can, assign, impact to their technologies being deployed.
No, you're absolutely right, Herb. I come from the transportation domain, and we often look at, looking towards the future, about intersections. Many accidents happen at intersections. What intersection do you improve for safety? It's not just the frequency of the collision, but it's all of those other factors. Response time of fire and EMS. Who doesn't get served because someone is getting served at a fender bender at an intersection? What about the response time at the emergency room at the hospital? And all of those dependent scenarios that for one traffic accident, there's an awful lot there. We also need to look at some of the technology-induced unexpected consequences. Like, I'm sure, Herb, you and I have both read studies about when the cost of autonomous vehicles drops so low, you may have a scenario where your autonomous taxi cab is circling the block, and fleets of them are circling the block, creating their own traffic jam, just waiting for a potential customer.
Absolutely. It's until a technology can be affordable. I mean, again, I've got to hand it to, Tesla. They not only have made Tesla, to me, is really as much of a energy storage company as it is a vehicle company, because until the battery technology was both affordable and also useful, it's great to be able to drive a Tesla, but if you can only go twice around the block and then you got to charge it for 20 hours, I mean, it's never going to get adopted. But you're absolutely right, Jim. I think you've got to make, a number of interconnected technologies useful, affordable, and obviously can have such significant consequences to where, back in the day when you couldn't put your laptop in the overhead bin because the lithium, ion battery was catching fire, kind of a bad problem to have if you're in flight. The technology had to evolve to make them safer too. So you're absolutely right.
Exactly. So let me ask you, Herb. So all is probably not rosy in the world of public-private partnerships. What are some challenges or pitfalls or things to think about as you consider embarking down that PPP road?
Oh, no, that's a really good question, Jim. I'm going to go to one that's a little bit more macro global, and then I'm going to go to kind of more US based and local. In the macro global, one of the challenges is a combination of speaking in a language where we can understand each other, because we don't always have the same common language. There's a level of trust. The trust has got a number of dimensions. There's frankly, there's waste, fraud, and abuse that happen all over the world. It's not just any one country, but the more differences of currencies or languages or even systems, creates inefficiencies that sometimes can be taken advantage of. But also the challenge of working, globally is that there's a lot of different challenges that we don't fully understand in all the dimensions. So it could lead to a lot of mistrust by the people too. So that's kind of on a global macro. Some of the things that have got to really change here, I think, or continue to evolve, is you have to have a continued recognition and understanding that it's got to be useful for all parties. Those mutual benefits are real. And I'll give you an example. I see, like many other companies, again, Pioneer Partners, we don't make software, we don't make hardware, we don't make anything. We sit in the middle. We help translate technology, product and services and technologies into applications and impact for cities. Conversely, we help the cities trying to understand, that they have to be able to communicate their needs of the citizens and, their leadership mission and vision and goals of the companies too. But sitting in the middle, you realize that you've really got to have a level of trust. And the level of trust is, if the technology, works, that's great. But marketing has a really good way of putting a spin on technology that's just not quite ready yet. And so the legacy of vaporware is one of those things that we really have to make sure that we're very diligent to be able to speak clearly of the technology and the capabilities. It's okay to have a roadmap to future releases. But if it's not quite there yet, you have to be very clear on that. And the roadmap has got to be reasonably accurate. You can't say it's coming and then it never comes. Another problem that we really see is that you've got organizations like cities that are issuing sometimes RFPs or these other requests that are really hard to respond to. And it's not that it's the hard is the problem, but that's the information that they need. That's great. But if they're going to issue these RFPs, they really need to respond in a way that it was a legitimate, bona fide request for an opportunity for somebody to be able to win a bid. And so I'm not suggesting that, all RFPs are not that way, but I will tell you that sometimes the cities issue them prematurely. They don't have a good understanding of what they're really asking for. And the amount of time it takes for these companies, whether you're big and especially if you're small, it is an enormous amount of time. And I know that some of the best companies no longer respond to RFPs at scale because the process in itself is arduous, or it's not always well designed to give the outcome that they're looking for, or maybe there's other challenges to begin with. So we've got to find a better way to be able to respond to the needs of the cities without having to go through these very long, arduous technologies. But really, everyone needs to be able to trust each other a little bit more, and we got to continue building this trust along with the public's trust along the way too. I think those are some of the biggest challenges, Jim.
Well, no, that's a really concise and insightful perspective. You do need to meet in the middle, and everyone needs to trust each other. But there was someone who said, "Verify, trust, but verify." The suppliers themselves, well, you're right. The marketing folks are paid to overpromise, and create their marketing hype. And on the other end, those agencies and those cities, often can create RFPs, or heck, not even RFP, an RFI, with perhaps no even funding behind it, just to perhaps look politically good in a marketing outreach to their own stakeholder communities. So it really is quite a bit of a challenge there. Let me ask this: as we've moved, into more sophisticated and mature public-private partnerships, have P3s changed the technologies themselves?
They really have. I can give you a couple examples of how some of the things that we live with every day really came through a couple different P3 models. And what's interesting is that you don't always realize how it's going to work until you just kind of get to the other end. So I'll give you an example. So have you ever seen those, or maybe you have one, Jim, those Roombas that are running around, they're really helpful,
Sure. Yeah.
So the Roomba came out from a DARPA funded project. I mean, they had a robot called Shaky the Robot back in the day. And really it was developed by a group called the Sanford Research Institute, or SRI International now. And really that Roomba that is, sweeping up after your, pet hair or whatever it may be, really came from this public-private partnership that they were trying to figure out what to do with the technology, what it could be useful for. And that technology evolved into a number of things that we have today. Whether it's the Mars rover, which, we've seen some of the stunning pictures that it came back, or the drones, or again, the Roomba, which is our domestic robot. It came out of a DARPA-funded project way back in the day. And that was really an example of, okay, let's take what is an interesting technology, but not quite useful. The original 6-foot-tall computer on wheels wasn't that useful, but we knew that we were onto something. If you get a little bit more practical into like the self-driving cars that we just talked about, that also came out. Interesting story. DARPA issued a challenge back in the day. And the goal, I think, was to be able to create a 142-mile course that you had to go, and drive across. And obviously, the Mojave Desert, which is where the track was, it's a safe place. You're not going to run over anyone. And it's also, while flat, not always the most friendly. The heat environment can be fairly hostile. Now, what was interesting was this $1 million prize that they offered had a lot of entrants. And the first year that they did this, not a single car finished. It was pretty interesting. So I think the longest was 7 miles that the car traveled, and everyone else died in the vine. Now, what was interesting, this was an example of an iterative process that it was a successful failure because the next year, back in in I think 2004 or 5, they upped the prize money to $2 million, and then they had 5 cars complete the course. Now that technology process led directly to things like AI enhanced video or LiDAR or ultrasonic sensors. Ultrasonic sensors are on the phone that you and I carry. That's how we get the range detection to figure out a good, crisp picture, on an iPhone or an Android phone. LiDAR, really useful in a lot of areas. Tesla and Mobileye, which was a technology that was on the front end side of, at least one of the versions of the Tesla early products. I mean, there's all types of stuff. And then the last thing, which is my favorite, Jim, I'm a little bit of a technology junkie at times, but I candidly, I don't adopt technology the first minute that it's out there because I know it can be kind of buggy. But I'm a big fan of, the voice assistant devices, by Amazon or by Google. And again, DARPA came in. They issued an award. I actually went to SRI in the early 2000s, and it developed a thing called the Cognitive Assistant that Learns and Organizes, or CALO, which SRI then formed a startup, a little-known startup called Siri in 2007. Apple acquired it in 2010, and that's now powering devices to include other competitor devices that we use today. So the role of technology and where it comes from is really interesting. That was an example of something that is now ubiquitous in so many consumer applications. And again, it's interesting, the federal government, private sector companies, in some cases, agencies like NASA, some of the states, gunshot detection came out of this. I mean, there's so many things that just come out from these partnerships. And if you really begin with the end in mind, saying, what are we trying to impact? What are we trying to achieve? Well, you don't always know until you get there. And so you've got to be open-minded, and really it's a consistent tuning in to the needs of both the public and the art of the possible, because as things become more possible, the demands go there with it. So it's a constant exchange, triangulating your way to what should we be doing, what should we be doing now.
Exactly. Exactly. So Herb, assuming let's put ourselves in the shoes of a city manager, a public works director, or maybe even a citizen activist. What would be the most important key elements for a successful public-private partnership?
Oh gosh, to me, it's defining the problem and the challenges, which is a similar side of the coin, but not the exact maybe side of the coin of what are you trying to achieve? Because again, if you think about technology as a tool set, you've got to ask, the folks, what are you trying to get it done? And so the same technology, let's say from the city side, that is trying to create more efficiency. It's not that they're using technology to replace workers, especially, in the great resignation era that we live in today, but they're trying to use technology to create labor, to do jobs maybe that are tedious or less desirable, or they can't find to be filled because they've got open work orders. And so that reducing errors, improving efficiency, lowering cost side to the other side of the citizen, or other side of the coin to the person, is, hey, I'd like to be able to, let's say, apply for a permit. And I don't want to have to drive across town to be able to go stand in a line, fill out a form, and then get sent the permit, 10 days later to be able to have, a picnic in a park shelter or maybe a festival. And so beginning with the end in mind for all the stakeholders involved. And in this exact case, you've got departments, you've got systems and technology. It'd also be very useful to understand what are the challenges to be able to get from point A to point B, because there's a lot of additional letters in that alphabet. So understanding the problem, understanding what you're trying to achieve, and getting the stakeholders involved on, this design thinking oriented process to look at things is the key. I think that's the key to every good smart city project or technology problem today.
So in shorthand, that is finding your stakeholders, defining stakeholder communities, extracting out of them user needs, and turning that into your project specification.
Yeah, absolutely. Bottoms up to represent the voice of the customer, the citizens. Top down to represent the mission, vision, and goals of the city, and get the folks in the middle to figure out how do we get from point A to point B to make sure that they understand, how they can interact with that equation to be able to deliver the results and get the benefit they need to. Absolutely.
Sure, and hopefully, deconstructing each of these needs so that there's a compelling financial model behind them.
Absolutely, and I think understanding the value of talking about what you're trying to do. The theory behind open innovation, instead of it being the stealth project where you're trying to be clever or protective to try and guard the idea and have the big aha moment, to where you're trying to find that needle in the haystack, you've got to switch it around. You've got to become, you broadcast the idea so the haystack finds you. You become the needle. Into where if you're trying to solve a problem, you really invite the community at large to comment on it, interact with it. You've got to build local support. Local isn't just, in the backyard that you live in, but the world community, academia, private sector company, other cities that have experienced similar challenges or things. I mean, being able to broadcast what you're doing to the world and then listening is really key.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge that the stakeholders come in such a variety of come with such a variety of perspectives that it's often a challenge, and it's difficult for any one person with one perspective to really understand where from which they see, from the position of which they see. We recently did a podcast with a company that instead of offering a 2D representation, a flat representation of street lighting, of the light falling on the road, the sidewalk, they recently come up with a 3D approach, and they take the lighting output files for each fixture, and as a result, in a 3D model, you can see light falling, on the vertical front door of your home, or you can see how the lighting levels change with changes in elevation, for example. That has proven to be very popular because the 2D with just colored circles really doesn't communicate much to some of those folks out there that might not be lighting engineers, for example. So it's interesting that you really do need to not only broadcast it out there, but try to understand how those stakeholders can really consume that information.
Absolutely. It reminds me of a project that we did, oh gosh, probably in 2000 and maybe 18 or so. And it was interesting because it was in a smaller community of about 100,000 folks. And it was a lighting related project as part of a smart city master planning, bigger plan. And really they were trying to reduce crime, improve public safety relative to feeling safe in a parking structure. But like many of these other, developments that are going up, it was mixed use. It was retail, office down, residential up in a 2, 3, 4-story, environment. And really, they needed that tunable lighting that was not only dimmable, but you could also tune it so that white lighting would shine through your window at night and keep you up all night because the circadian rhythms were messed up. But really, it's hard to see the impact of this when you're just looking at a 2-dimensional diagram. Being able to look at something interactive or 3-dimensional, or look at, the foot candles and the throw and how bright it's going to be coming through. And, I got to get a shade and not, Venetian blinds because it's going to otherwise come through. I mean, there's so many dimensions. And I think even the additional technologies that can help people simulate the impact of the technology before they really take a substantial risk in either, certainly the cost or the time, or even the public backlash of getting something wrong because they could have avoided it. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of a small city in the Northeast where less than 100,000 people, and there was a small college campus 2 miles outside of town, and a satellite classroom or two downtown. The mayor wanted to put up kiosks to lead the kids, the students, to the downtown and back and forth, but the cost of a kiosk is quite substantial. And when we really looked at all of the stakeholders, what actually came out of this? Well, better lighting. Well, LED lighting saved energy, enough energy to create some free Wi-Fi, high bandwidth internet for the students and downtown business district. as well as it also funded for 2 kiosks. So you really need to look at this integration and of all of these applications, but also be able to communicate to, in this case, the students, that you'll have better Wi-Fi, then you could do your homework, outside or in this remote building, as well as offering the mayor what he wanted to, so that he could drive the funding, which was a couple of kiosks that he could pose with in his campaign literature.
Right. No, it's it. Yeah, I mean, even the kiosks have gone through such an evolution, Jim. We used to somewhat joke that and again, and there's some truth to this, sometimes you have to have what I'll call quicker wins for these public-private partnerships to be successful, because the citizens will see planning meetings and they'll hear a lot of, buzz in the media, but then now they're looking for something that's visible, because some of the most important things that you're going to do are invisible. Putting up public Wi-Fi, it's not like you can see it going through the airways. I mean, people sure know it when they don't have it and they get frustrated. But when you put it up, while they're thankful, you don't get a lot of thank you cards in the mail, but it's invisible. You can't see it. Those kiosks are, sometimes we, kind of joke, they're like oversized iPads that, you take a 6.5 foot kiosk, shove it in the sidewalk, and all of a sudden the citizens think, oh, that's that smart city headline that I saw, and this must be the result of it. But those kiosks really have evolved from just what I'll call a gimmicky, Wi-Fi hotspot, to much more interesting things, beyond wayfinding. The digital advertising model hasn't quite worked out as people have thought. But really, especially in this era of additional sensorization, the cabinetry, that safe place to be able to pull power and have a secured location.
No, exactly. Vehicle locations, 5G equipment, on the roadside.
There's so many things that those kiosks can do, and we haven't even figured out half of them, in the near future. But that physical location is so important. It's everything. And there's so many different things that manufacturers or early stage companies really should be thinking about, because the needs of the city and the people. I mean, there's all types of stuff when you have a physical location that's close to the action that you can do.
Exactly. Herb, we're nearing the end of our hour. Let me ask somewhat of a comprehensive question. So if I am that city manager, what's a cookbook approach? How do I create a successful public-private partnership?
So if I were to give kind of a point form narrative real quick back, first understand what you're trying to achieve. Who are the stakeholders that are involved? Usually it's citizens, residents, but also some of the folks that city managers need to be thinking about, whether they like it or not, is most cities are competing for people. People provide that workforce that attracts employers, and that high quality of life and the job that you want comes from people. So you've got to build a very high quality, highly livable, safe, secure city. So if you don't have a safe and secure and high quality life, I mean, you're really on the back end. And by the way, your neighboring community, whether it's across, the city limit or in another state, I've seen signs, billboards saying, hey, move to X community, we'll give you $15,000 to move. So city managers really need to think, okay, what are we trying to affect? And a lot of times it's an economic development dimension. The next thing that they really got to think about is, okay, what's our time frame to include everything from problems that are firsthand, what funding they have available, the ability to be able to pair up, funding, you can float a, municipal bond if you can achieve a cost savings. There's, ESCO models to where you can get a cost reduction that's being paid for by performance. You can look at federal funding. Maybe you can get a grant. Maybe it's all four of those things if you've got emerging technology that can be useful. But the funding piece, you got to assess what is the funding. But now it goes back to ROI. What is the impact that the city needs to be able to make this a valuable use of both their money and their time, and frankly, the trust of the citizens? If you kind of define those, you can reach out to the additional stakeholders to start creating these partnerships to figure out who is it, why would they be interested, and are they available right now with a useful technology that can start implementing. And it's a holistic point of view. That's the last piece. You've got to have a holistic view because all the technologies are interconnected. You can't look at things in silos. Nothing exists in a silo today. And if you don't understand the dependency of the technologies or how one thing can make another technology more valuable by complementary data or creative, then you're really missing the boat.
That's true. I mean, there are the economic, social and environmental, aspects to this. But ultimately, it is important to remember that public agencies tend to rely on one of three models to actually drive revenue, and it's sales tax, income tax, or property tax. So ultimately, at the end of the day, you're looking to amplify, the sources from one or all of those.
That's absolutely true. I think the one that's recently emerging, and it hasn't emerged fully, is, the pandemic really forced an almost overnight virtualization of more city services than people really were intending to virtualize, because you couldn't go to work, you couldn't provide the services, and the citizens couldn't come in for the services too, but the city services had to continue. So that cost reduction factor is very real, and it's not just technology and jobs, it's workflow, the cost of time. And so there's a number of ways you can finance things, and it's not always perfectly obvious from a pure basis, but there's a lot of work studies, technology impact, analysis that can be conducted by different groups that can really try and do some quantification of the impact of technologies.
Great. Well, Herb, we're nearing the end of our hour. Do you have any last comments for our audience today?
Well, the last comment I'd have is, public-private partnerships are real. They're not going away. They're more useful than ever before. They're really a way to, I think, even speed up the innovation process that ultimately has a bigger impact on people. And I think more than ever, we've got all types of challenges that we really have got to address. So my hat's off for those that are on the front lines of the public-private partnerships and the innovation, the folks that are making it happen, like your firm. But aside from that, I mean, we all are in this together. We've got to think collectively, together, but we all can play a role if we just kind of speak the common language and realize that we can help each other in these partnerships.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Herb. Again, my guest today was Herb C. And Herb, let me ask you, if our listeners would like to reach out and contact you, what is your contact information?
Sure. Well, you can go to Pioneer Partners website. It's p3pioneers.com. Again, we came out of the Think Big Partners era. That was our original kind of company. You can find plenty of our work product on that as well. You can always contact me by email as well. It's herb.sih@p3pioneers.com. And, you can find us through different partners too. We work with large technology companies, engineering firms. Again, we're technology and vendor agnostic. We've got a lot of great people out there. And if anyone wants to contact us, look, we're happy to just point you in the right direction, have an intelligent conversation. Certainly, we're happy to, help people make an impact in their community too, whether you're a city or a technology company or whatever it is. We're all in this together.
Well, Herb, thank you very much for joining me today, and hopefully we'll have you on again with new developments in the world of smart city public-private partnerships. And to everyone who's listening in today, thank you very much for attending this Smart City podcast, and we look forward to you listening in on future episodes as well. Thank you very much.
Broadcasting from Boston, Massachusetts, the Smart Cities podcast is the only podcast dedicated to all things smart cities. The podcast is the creation of ARC Advisory Group's Smart City practice. ARC advises leading companies, municipalities, and governments on technology trends and market dynamics that affect their business and quality of life in their cities. To engage further, please like and share our podcast or reach out directly on Twitter @SmartCityViewpoints or on our website at www.arcweb.com/industries/smart-cities.